We're starting this class on the topic of tenets, and it's not an easy topic. It's challenging, but very worthwhile, very beneficial. So the reason we study tenets is mainly because we want to be free of suffering. We want to be happy. We want to reach liberation and enlightenment. And what prevents us from being happy and liberated and enlightened is ignorance about our own self, I, who we are, what we are, how we exist. So we just don't know ourselves as we really are. We're ignorant of our real nature. And we're also ignorant of the nature of other people and things in the world around us and everything. We see everything in mistaken ways. And these mistakes didn't come from our parents or our education system or our government. We were born with them. We came into this life with a mind that wasn't like a blank slate, pure and clear, but full of mistaken ideas, attitudes, conceptions, as well as seeds of afflictive emotions, attachment, anger, and so on. So these have been in our mind from beginningless time, carried life after life after life, keeping us in samsara, causing us to experience lots of suffering and problems. So how to get out of this situation? As Geshe Yoshitake has said a number of times, it's not enough just to stop thinking and stop looking at things and just go into a sort of blank-minded state, which might feel very good, might be very kind of calm and peaceful. But that's not the way to become free of ignorance and the other mistaken attitudes we have, mistaken conceptions, afflictive emotions. They're not going to go away just by not looking at them. We have to engage in study, analysis, investigation to be able to recognize how we are wrong, how our way of seeing things is mistaken. So that's the real purpose of learning tenets. So the Buddha taught all of these different views in the different tenet schools, and he taught in different ways suited to different people. To some, he taught the view of emptiness of inherent existence. That's considered the highest, most correct, accurate view of things. We've heard that many times. But do we really understand what that means? Do we really understand the meaning of inherent existence and how things are empty of that? It's actually very difficult, very subtle. And so to understand that, it's very helpful to understand the views of the other tenet schools, which are not as profound, not as deep, not as subtle. So they can be compared to steps of a staircase or rungs of a ladder that lead us gradually to the highest and most profound and most accurate view of things. So generate the wish to engage in this study, to free yourself from ignorance and other mistaken ideas and attitudes and emotions, but ultimately to reach full enlightenment, Buddhahood, and be able to help all other sentient beings to likewise become free, liberated, and eventually enlightened. There are a number of different texts or books on this topic of tenets. Some of them are huge, like Jeffrey I haven't actually read it, but it's called Maps of the Profound. It's like this big. We have it in our library. I think it's Jamyang Shepa's text on tenets. And there's another one in there by Changyur Rilpe Dorje, which is also pretty hefty. And then there's this book. We have a few copies of these, Cutting Through Appearances. Not the whole book is about tenets. The first part is about the three principal aspects of the path, so maybe just 2/3 of it is about tenets. So this is really excellent as well. Kuncho Jigme Wangpo's text on tenets with Geshe Zopa's explanation, commentary, translated by Jeffrey. I thought to use the text that I studied myself, and it was actually 42 years ago, not 30. I realized about 1980, I had the chance to study this with Geshe Jama Tekchok, wonderful teacher. Yeah, so the author of this text is Jetsun Chokyi Gyaltsen, and so he was born about 50 years after Lama Tsongkhapa passed away. So, you know, pretty close to Lama Tsongkhapa, and I wasn't able to find a lot of information about him, but he studied and taught at Tashi Lunpa Monastery, which is the monastery of the Panchen Lamas, and also at Sera Monastery. And he was, at a later part of his life, he was an abbot of Sera Monastery, the 12th abbot. And he wrote many texts. There's 7 volumes of his texts mainly on Madhyamaka, Prajnaparamita, tenets. And in Sera Monastery, Sera J Monastery, there's Sera J and Sera May. The Sera J Monastery, the students who study there, they mainly use his texts as their textbooks. So he's the textbook writer for Sera J. So in the FPMT centers, most of the Geshes have studied at Sera J. So, you know, they teach Jetsun Chokyi Gyaltsen's text. When I studied it with Geshe Jama Tekchok, it wasn't translated. In fact, we didn't know of any translations of any philosophical texts at that time. We had a copy of Jeffrey Hopkins' PhD dissertation, which later became the book Meditation on Emptiness, but it was still in the form of a PhD thesis, which is like double spaced, page after page. I don't think there's any index or any, you know, it's like you're trying to find something in there. It's very difficult. And so we were just like, we were so grateful that Geshe-la gave us the teachings, and then our translator translated it, and then we were just writing notes down, but we didn't have a copy of the text. And then a year or two after studying it, there was another group of students that wanted to study this topic, and Geshe-la didn't have time to teach it, so he asked me to teach it. And I'm sure I was very reluctant. I can't do that. But he said, okay, I'll help you. And he did. You know, I would go to him almost every day with questions. Because it's one thing to listen to teachings, but when you have to explain it to others, it's like, oh, what does this mean? So he was very, very helpful. And while teaching that class, I translated the text, but not all by myself, of course. I was very much relying on Geshe Tekchok's explanations, and also our translator, who is a monk, Venerable Samten Chupel. So he helped very much to translate, but that's how I came up with the translation of the text. And I haven't looked at it since then, hardly. It has been used a few times by some students, and they did some corrections to it, but I thought it might be helpful to look at it again. Mm-hmm. So I've sent that to you, and I thought we'll go through that text. And there's also a commentary by Geshe Jama Tekchok given at Nalanda Monastery, which You can read that on your own. I will sometimes refer to it, but it's more for you to read on your own if you have time. And there's actually a lot of other materials as well. And I was thinking maybe somebody could make a Google Doc. What do you call those things? Like a place where we can put all these different materials and then people can download them if they want. Because there's, I don't know, it's like a little booklet that Geshe Kelsang Wangmo put together. She sort of wrote it on her own, but of course she's got an amazing knowledge and it's really wonderful and really clear. So I can make that available to you. She taught this course at Tushita, I don't know when, some years ago. And I guess this was a book they used during the course. And there's two other translations of this text. One is by Glenn Svensson, who was a student in the first master's program at Lama Tsongkhapa Institute. Another is by Ian Coughlin or Jampa Yignan. He was a monk at Sarah for a long time. So they maybe the scholars who want to kind of compare how other translators have translated the text, I can make those available as well. And there's various charts as well. I didn't want to overload you with too much material, but I thought this chart is very helpful. And so I asked Venerable Wamsel to make copies of it. So it's like a map, just for you to keep, especially those who haven't studied this before. So across the top, you have the four main schools, Vaibashika, Sautrantika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamaka. And then each, or not all of them, but some of them have sub-schools. We won't go through this now, but it's just for you to have to look at and figure out where we're at. And it's also nice because it mentions some of the proponents of each school, so you know who's who in the Sautrantikas and Chittamatras and so on, and their dates. So that's kind of nice information. So what I'm planning to do today is just to kind of give a general introduction of the topic of tenets, and we might get into Vaibhashika, the first school. But so why we study this, as I mentioned during the motivation, it's to overcome ignorance. So Geshe Jama Tekchok in his commentary says, the purpose of studying tenets is to gain the light of wisdom that discriminates between correct and incorrect beliefs. So we actually have a lot of beliefs that we may not even be aware of. They might be kind of unconscious and they're incorrect. So we need to be able to recognize those. And all of the different tenet schools were taught by the Buddha. Some Western scholars, I think, question that. They think that the Tibetans just invented these different schools. But Geshe says that, there's one tantric text where the Buddha names all the four schools, gives refers to them by name. And in a commentary to the Vajra Tantra by Vajragarbha, it says, it is not the subduer's thought that a fourth vehicle or a fifth school of tenets exists for Buddhists. So anyway, there are some references, at least in the tantric texts, that the Buddha did intend that there are four schools of tenets. Well, the Buddha, it was like a doctor. So a good doctor doesn't give the same kind of medicine to everybody. That would be very unskillful. And so the Buddha would teach according to the minds of his listeners. So there were some listeners who were ready for Madhyamaka Prasangika view, and he taught that. Others, for them, that would have been too much. They may have fallen into nihilism, and maybe gone crazy or something. So the Buddha would teach Chittamatra view or Vaibhashika view. Okay, so that's the reason for the existence of these different views. They're for different types of people with different kinds of minds. And so it's important that we have respect for all of these different traditions. you know. And in fact, some of the proponents of the schools that are lower than Prasangika were brilliant, brilliant, amazing, amazing minds. And so we shouldn't sort of disparage them and think, I'm a Prasangika and he's just a Vaibashika or a Chidamatra or something like that. Would be very unskillful. It's also helpful, living here at the Abbey, because Venerable Chödrön is teaching the books from the Library of Compassion and Wisdom, and that's kind of presenting different points of view, and then different schools are mentioned there. So it is helpful to have some familiarity with all of these different schools and their different points of view. So there's various benefits. I have a slide a little bit later for some more benefits that were mentioned by Geshe-ma. The first slide on here is the 3 wheels of Dharma. You've probably heard this before, but in case some of you haven't, it said that the Buddha turned the wheel of Dharma 3 times. And the first wheel, his very first teaching after his enlightenment, he taught at Varanasi. Those teachings were intended for what's sometimes called Hinayana. Venerable uses the term fundamental vehicle, which is quite nice. So those were the intended trainees for those teachings. And the main subject of those teachings was the 4 truths, and of course many other things as well, but mainly the 4 truths. And in those teachings, the Buddha taught that all phenomena exist by way of their own character. I kind of wonder, did he really actually say that? Or is it just implied that, the way he taught, that's the conclusion you come to? But anyway, that's what the Tibetans say. And then the second wheel, when it says it was taught at Vulture Peak, that's the beginning of it, but it could have been given other places as well. So Vulture Peak in Rajgir, not too far from Bodh Gaya, and that's where he taught the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, of which there are a number of different ones, like the Heart Sutra is a short one, but there's very long ones as well. And those teachings were meant for universal vehicle trainees, Mahayana trainees. And there, the Buddha taught that all phenomena do not exist by way of their own character. That's, according to Prasangika, existing by way of their own character or not existing by way of their own character is another way of talking about inherent existence. Okay, so saying that, this thermos exists by way of its own character means it's inherently existing, and all those synonyms. So in the second wheel teachings, the Buddha said all phenomena do not exist by way of their own character. They do not exist inherently, injectively, and so on. When Jay Garfield was teaching a couple of years ago, I did some classes on the Sutra Unraveling the Thought, and that's anyway another sutra in which this bodhisattva named Paramartha Samagata asked the Buddha, "What's going on here? The first teaching you gave, you said all phenomena do exist by way of their own character, and then the second wheel, you said that phenomena do not exist by way of their own character. Sounds contradictory." And so then the Buddha replied by differentiating. Some phenomena do exist by way of their own character, and some phenomena do not. So he differentiated. So that was the start of the third wheel. That was how the third wheel arose, and it said that was taught at Vaishali, also in that same area, northern India. And this is said to be intended for trainees of both vehicles, so both universal and fundamental vehicle trainees are intended trainees for the third wheel. So there the Buddha, he said which phenomena do exist and which do not exist by way of their own character. So that's something we'll get into later, mainly when we get to the Chittamatra school. So the Chittamatra or mind-only school regard the third wheel as the main one, the main wheel that they follow. And Madhyamaka schools regard the second wheel as the main one, the most important one. So this is kind of a way of summarizing the main messages, teachings given by the Buddha. So there's this saying, you've probably heard this before, it's from the Kadampa Geshis, who are followers of Atisha, really real yogis, meditators. So that they have this saying, meditating without studying is like trying to climb a mountain without hands. Great image. So we want to, realize the true nature of things and get out of samsara and get to enlightenment. But if we don't study, we just sit down and meditate. How do we know what we're doing? So it's very important that we study as a basis for our meditation. The second point says it enables us to identify innate misapprehensions that we have and analyze these. So again, we have within us, we're born with these mistaken states of mind about our own I and others and everything else. And so we have to be able to recognize these and then investigate them. Are these correct or not? And that's the only way to be free of them. They won't just go away by themselves. We can't pray to Buddha to take them away from us. But we have to analyze them. And then the third point, study of the lower tenet schools enables us to understand the higher ones. So that it's like a staircase, like, if you want to, it's like a 4-story building and there's no elevator or escalator. There's only stairs. And so you can't get to the 4th story without going through the other stories. You have to, go gradually. So in a similar way, we can't really understand Madhyamaka Prasangika, higher school, without understanding the others. And then last point, it provides us with an inner force to distinguish correct and incorrect perspectives so we can penetrate reality. So of course it's good to cultivate love and compassion and patience and do mind training practices and develop calm abiding. Those are part of the path as well. We have to do those, but just those alone will not enable us even to get out of samsara. We can get good rebirths in samsara, but if we want to get out of samsara, we have to gain the realization of emptiness, the true nature of things, wisdom, realizing emptiness. So that's the real meaning, the real reason, the real purpose for doing this kind of study. The term in Tibetan we translate as tenets is drupta, and drup means established, ta means conclusion. It also has other meanings like end or limit, but here conclusion is a good term. So Geshe Jamtekshuk said, after studying a philosophical system, so you first have to study a system. You have to learn its beliefs, its explanations. You have to study, and you also have to think about it, and also good to debate, discuss with others to make sure you have a good understanding. When one establishes the final meaning of a set of scriptures or teachings in one's mind, and then explains these to others, one becomes a proponent of tenets. So we're going to come to a definition of that a little bit later. What is a proponent of tenets? Geshe-ma says that tenets are not mere beliefs. So, it's easy to say, oh yeah, everything is merely labeled by the mind. Nothing is inherently existing. So we heard that many times from His Holiness and Venerable Children and other teachers, and we read it in books, and it's easy to say, to just say those words, but does that mean we really understand what we're saying? That we have really established the meaning of that in our life? So she says, a proponent of Buddhist tenet should be someone who studied and analyzed the different concepts of the Buddha Dharma, and who comprehends the implications of accepting one view and refuting another. Okay, so you really have to go quite deep into studying these different views. And in fact, another book I really love, it's called Appearance and Reality by Newland. And he's only talking about the two truths in each of the four schools. But it's great, partly because he's a Westerner, he's one of us, and so he's explaining things in an American way, and also the kind of doubts and questions that he has, or things that we can really relate to. So in this book, he says, it is said that to be a proponent of a particular tenet system, one must realize the selflessness explained by that system. So that's a pretty high bar. And I haven't come across that anywhere else. Geshe-la didn't say it, Geshe Teksha didn't say it, but maybe some say that, that to actually say, I am a proponent of Madhyamaka tenets, you have to actually have a realization of emptiness. But that shouldn't discourage us, because of course the more we study and discuss and meditate on these topics, then the more we will gain an understanding of them. So the text starts off with homage basically to the gurus. It says, homage to all who are holy and venerable, existing inseparable in entity with Lama Protector Manju Shri. And then it gives a definition of a Buddhist propounder of tenets. Oh, it says there's 3 points: definition, divisions, and then the meaning of each division. So this is a definition of a proponent of Buddhist tenets, because there are or were and still are schools of non-Buddhist tenets. We encountered some of those when we were studying Pramanavartika with Geshe Shitapke. For example, the Charvakas, the hedonists or materialists. There was another school called the Mimamsakas and so on. So actually, I think in Maps of the Profound, it probably does go into these other schools of tenets, which is helpful. I haven't done much of that, but just to see what kind of views people had prior to the Buddha, what were people thinking about and teaching and practicing, at the time of the Buddha. Because, Buddha's teachings did come out of that situation, and a lot of the things Buddha taught were kind of in response to what other people were saying, other teachers were saying at that time. And so, if you have a lot of time, it's good to do that. So somebody who is a proponent of Buddhist tenets is a proponent of tenets who accepts the 3 jewels as ultimate. And when I looked at that, I thought, what? Why did I put ultimate? Because the Tibetan word yamtag usually is translated as perfect or correct or authentic. So I think it may have been Geshe-la or the translator who suggested ultimate. I don't think I would have come up with that on my own. But anyway, you can choose. You can take your pick, whichever term you like. Perfect is nice. Perfect objects of refuge, okay? And does not assert any other objects of refuge than those. So this is to distinguish a Buddhist proponent of tenets from a proponent of tenets of some other school, like Charvaka or Samkhya or whatever. So the main distinction is that taking refuge in the three jewels, holding the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, as ultimate or perfect, ideal objects of refuge. But they also have to be someone who propounds tenets, who is a proponent of tenets. Now, it's also said that the second bullet point, a Buddhist is someone who takes refuge in the three jewels from the depths of their heart. So there's a difference between a proponent of Buddhist tenets, and a Buddhist. Yeah? How many possibilities are there between a proponent of Buddhist tenets and a Buddhist, a mere Buddhist? 3. Pause it. Give examples.
Someone who is a Buddhist and who is a proponent of Buddhist tenets. Someone,
For example,
oh,
Dalai Lama.
yeah.
Okay. What about a proponent of Buddhist tenets who is not a Buddhist?
Okay.
No
The
way.
provision doesn't go there.
Impossible. No such thing. A Buddhist who's not a proponent of Buddhist tenets? Yeah, I mean, somebody who just takes refuge but hasn't actually studied. There's millions in Asia especially, but also in other, people who have great faith in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, but they haven't really studied tenets. So you ask them to explain selflessness or any of these things, they wouldn't be able to, but they still have great faith. And then, of course, somebody who's neither, like maybe Pope Francis. Lots of people. So this is helpful because, for one thing, there's a book called What Makes You Not a Buddhist? Has anyone read that?
Long ago.
Yeah, I didn't read it. I was just kind of glancing through it. But one thing I read that just shocked me, he said, this is if I remember correctly, I haven't had time to go back and look at it, but he says, if you believe in inherent existence, you're not a Buddhist. What do you think about that? Well, that leaves out a huge number of people. Everybody except Madhyamika Prasangikas. Oh, ouch. Yeah, so I think it's quite important to understand what it takes to be a Buddhist. What is the real meaning of being a Buddhist? At least according to our school, that the bottom line is taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. You don't have to have studied tenets. You don't even have to know how to read, As long as you really have faith in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha from your heart, that is enough to make you a Buddhist. And then on top of that, if you have studied any of the tenet systems, not just Madhyamika Prasangika, but any of the tenet systems, and you at least hold those views, you believe in them, you follow them, you practice them, then you're still a Buddhist, and you might even be a proponent of Buddhist tenets. So that's a much more inclusive explanation than what was presented in that book. This isn't mentioned in the Jetsun Chokyi Gyaltsen's commentary, but it's also said that a proponent of Buddhist tenets needs to accept the 4 seals. So that's another criteria. And you've probably heard these before, but in case you haven't. So this is actually the way of distinguishing proponents of Buddhist tenets from those of non-Buddhist tenets. The Buddhists accept these 4 seals, that all compounded phenomena are impermanent. What is the meaning of compounded phenomena?
Causes and conditions bring it into existence.
Yeah, things that come into existence from causes and conditions. So all those kind of things are impermanent, change moment by moment. And then number 2, all contaminated phenomena are dukkha. Venerable uses the term polluted, but I think most other books and teachers use contaminated phenomena. So contaminated phenomena, this is a little tricky. There are different explanations of contaminated phenomena. In the Prasangika school, and probably Madhyamikas in general, contaminated phenomena are things that are affected by ignorance. They come into existence in dependence on ignorance and other afflictions, or at least ignorance. So they're all contaminated by ignorance. In the Vaibhashika school, which we'll come to later, they say that a contaminated phenomena is something that is amenable to increase contaminations in the sense of afflictive emotions. So, for example, this thermos is contaminated because when we look at it or touch it or relate to it in any way, we could get afflicted. Our afflictions could increase. We could get attached to it. So it could cause attachment to increase. Not that it's, doing that from its own side, but, in relation to that object, we can have more attachment. Or we could get angry at it and want to destroy it. So things that can increase our afflictions are contaminated. So there could be different ways of explaining contaminated. But anyway, all contaminated phenomena are dukkha, are unsatisfactory, miserable suffering. Number 3, this is also tricky. All phenomena are selfless. And each of the 4 schools has different, well, not completely. There are different explanations of selflessness. What is the meaning of selfless? So we'll get into that later. But the only common meaning that will cover all the 4 schools is this one. They lack a permanent, unitary, independent self. That's the kind of self that many of the non-Buddhist schools believe in. A soul, an Atman that's permanent, unchanging, unitary, doesn't have parts, independent of causing conditions. So they taught that kind of a self or a soul. But all the Buddhists are unanimous that there's no such thing as a permanent, unitary, independent self. So that's the meaning of selflessness that covers all the Buddhist schools. And that's kind of a very coarse meaning of selflessness, the coarsest one. Another one that's still kind of coarse is the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. We'll get more into that later. However, they say there's, in the Vaibhashika, the Vaibhashika actually includes 18 different sub-schools. We're not going to go into all of those, don't worry. But there's one of those sub-schools that, I think Geshe-la mentioned this recently. They say that there is a kind of self that is neither permanent nor impermanent, neither, I forget what's the other thing they say. Yeah, it's called the Vatsiputriyas, that school. So they do say it's kind of, it's not a permanent, unitary, independent self, but it's still some kind of self. And so they're kind of out there, and they're still a Buddhist. They're still considered a Buddhist school, but they have that particular view. So that's why we have to say that to cover them, to include them, we have to say selflessness means this, lack of a permanent, unitary, independent self. They do agree with that, but they still assert another kind of self. In volume 2 of the books Venerable's doing, when the 4 seals are explained, it says that according to Prasangika, this 3rd seal means emptiness of inherent existence. All phenomena are empty of inherent existence. But that's exclusive to Prasangika. So if you want to be inclusive, including all the Buddhist schools, then we have to explain it in that way. And the fourth seal is nirvana is peace. So nirvana is the cessation of all dukkha, all suffering, and the causes of suffering. So it's not a place, it's not a physical place we go to, like a heaven. And it's also not even a state of mind. I think I did say that. It's like it's a state of mind, but it's not really a state of mind in the sense that it's not consciousness, it's not mental. But it's a situation in which a mind exists when that mind has become totally free of all the afflictive obscurations, the ignorance and all the delusions and so on, and therefore all dukkha. So that's the meaning of nirvana. So nirvana is real peace. Because some of the non-Buddhist schools, some of the proponents and practitioners of those schools developed a very good concentration, samadhi, and they attained the various levels of the four jhanas, the four concentrations, and the four formless absorptions, which, I mean, those states of mind must be just out of this world. And some of them thought that's nirvana, because it's so peaceful. When you're in those states of mind, you don't feel any pain, any mental pain or physical pain. Your delusions aren't jumping all over the place. So peaceful, so blissful. And so they reached those states of mind and thought, that's nirvana. You know? So the Buddha was unique in explaining a different kind of nirvana than what other teachers of his time explained. He attained a state where it wasn't just peaceful, but the ignorance and the afflictions, attachment and so forth were totally uprooted and eliminated from the mind such that they will never occur again. So that's real nirvana, according to Buddhism. Real peace. Divisions of the Buddhist schools. I'm putting words in red, and those are changes I made already to the translation. Yeah, so maybe I'll one of these days come up with a different translation. But yeah, so these are the four schools, and when I learned them, I learned the Sanskrit names, so I'm more familiar with those. Some people prefer the English names, so it's up to you how you want to learn them. So the first school is Vaibhashika, which is usually translated as Great Exposition, or Particularists is the translation that I came up with, or we came up with back then. Sautrantika, Sutra followers. Chittamatra, mind only. And then the text actually says at this point, non-entitylessness. It doesn't say madhyamaka, middle way. It says non-entitylessness, but that refers to madhyamaka. They are the ones who are proponents of non-entitylessness, which means absence of inherent existence, emptiness of inherent. No, sorry, we have to say emptiness of true existence. But that'll come later. That's the last school we study. And it says the first two are also known as the two schools that propound, and then in brackets, truly existent external objects. I don't know what did I put the first time. It's kind of like that. They propound the meaning because there's the word dun there. That's all it says, dun. But again, we didn't have many dictionaries back then, and we didn't have other books we could refer to see, to find things out. But I did find in one of the current dictionaries that that these two schools, which is Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, they have this kind of nickname, this term for them, that they propound, it just says dun, which can mean object or meaning, but what it means is truly existent external objects. Because, as you probably know, the Chittamatra, mind-only school, and one type of Madhyamaka say there's no external objects. We've been talking about that in Geshe Topke's class, like the thermos, it seems like it's external, it seems like it's out there, and I just come along and see it or touch it, but that's not correct. The thermos that we see comes from our mind, an imprint in our mind left from some past experience, and that ripens and causes us to see the thermos. And everything else, everything we see, are just imprints, kind of like, it's like our mind is a movie projector, just projecting all these things out there. They look like they're out there and they're real, but that's an illusion. And that's the big mistake. That's what causes us to stay in samsara, thinking that things are real out there as they appear. But in fact, they're not. So that's the Chittamatra view. And the other schools, like the first two schools, Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, don't agree with that. They say there are external objects. Things are out there. Okay? And not only that, but they're truly existent. They're real. They're truly existing, inherently existing. So that's something that distinguishes those two schools from all the others.
I have a question
here. Mm-hmm.
The non-entitylessness, there's kind of a double negation there. And in the Tibetan, I only see the single negation. Should it be non-entityness or entitylessness? Should it actually be a double negation?
So proponents of absence of entitylessness, non-entity. Oh, you're right. Non-entityness. So it should be non-entityness. Thank you for pointing that out. I'll correct that before I send the slides. Yeah, so they propound that things are lacking entity, meaning lacking inherent existence. Yeah, when you study Buddhist philosophy, there's so many different terms, and many of them have the same meaning, but not always. That's one of the big difficulties in doing this kind of study. Yeah.
You're saying how Chittamatrans would say our problem is that we see objects as existing out there, like completely separate from the mind. Wouldn't also Madhyamikas agree that that's a problem? It's just the source of that object is different.
Yeah, the Prasangikas also say that the things that we see are dependent on our mind, but they don't go as far as the Chittamatrans and say there's no external objects. They, except for one type of Madhyamaka, the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka, they agree with the Chittamatrans. But the other Madhyamakas do assert external objects. But they are not totally out there, independent of the mind. They do depend on the mind, but how they depend on the mind is a different way than the Chittamatras explain. So another thing is the first two schools are said to be Hinayana, or fundamental vehicle schools, and the second two are Mahayana, or universal. And there's reasons for saying that. It's not what we normally think. Normally we think of the difference between Hinayana and Mahayana as Hinayanas are trying to achieve just nirvana for themselves, and Mahayana are trying to achieve enlightenment for all sentient beings. But when it comes to tenets, the tenet schools, there are different criteria for saying one is Hinayana and one is Mahayana. And I'll come to that a little later. I don't know if we'll have time for it today, and actually in Geshe-ma's notes or booklet, she has 7 different reasons or 7 different points distinguishing the Hinayana and the Mahayana tenet systems. I'll just mention a few of them. But just regarding the order of how they're arranged. Oh, back. Geshe-ma says this order is from the point of view of Madhyamaka. So the meaning of Madhyamaka is middle way. And the meaning of middle way is avoiding 2 extremes of what's sometimes called eternalism. What does Venerable use? Absolutism, eternalism, permanence on one hand, and then nihilism on the other hand. So every school, in fact, considers that they are the middle way, that they are avoiding those 2 extremes. But how they avoid the 2 extremes is unique to each school. Maybe one day we'll have a chart showing that. But from the point of view of Madhyamaka, looking at the other schools, they say all the schools except us are in the extreme of permanence or absolutism. They're all, falling into that extreme because they have the most refined and most subtle object of negation, what is being negated in the view of selflessness. And so that it's from the point of view of their tenets that this arrangement is made. The Vaibhashika are kind of the more gross, and then Sautrantika a little more subtle, and then Chittamatra a little more subtle, and then finally Madhyamaka. But if it was another school that was making the arrangement for Chittamatra, they'd probably put them in a different order and put themselves at the top. Or the Vaibhashikas would put themselves at the top. So it all depends on which point of view you're looking at all the 4 schools. And Geshe-ma says that despite this hierarchical order, all 4 are considered to be of equal importance because studying and understanding them is said to be a vital tool for the cultivation of wisdom. So we should respect all of them. And she said, historical records show that proponents of all 4 schools lived together at Nalanda Monastery. And they studied together and they learned from each other. So I think that's very nice to have respect for all of them. Okay, so then, so in the text, each of the schools is explained by way of these 7 points. There's a definition of a person who propounds those tenets, and divisions of the different schools, etymology, why are they called that? Why do they have that name? How they assert objects, things that we perceive, experience. How they assert object possessors, which mainly refers to minds or consciousnesses that see objects. How they assert a selflessness. And then grounds and paths. Grounds and paths, those 2 terms are actually synonymous, and they refer to mental states, realizations. So how does one actually progress in one's mental development until one reaches one's goal, whether it's nirvana or enlightenment? What are the different stages you go through, the different realizations you achieve in your progress towards your goal? Okay, so we can start now looking at the first school, Vaibhashika. So there's a definition of a Vaibhashika. I didn't put it on the slide, but you can look at the text. It says the definition of a Vaibhashika is one who propounds Hinayana tenets and asserts external objects to be truly existent, but does not assert self-cognizer. So I thought at this point it would be helpful to explain Hinayana tenets versus Mahayana tenets. And so, like I said, Geshe-ma explains a number of different points, so I'll just mention a few of those. So Hinayana tenet systems, the first point here is they assert only a selflessness of persons, but not selflessness of phenomena. So that's one of the differences between Hinayana and Mahayana tenets. Mahayana tenets, Chittamatra and Madhyamaka, they have a selflessness of persons and the selflessness of phenomena. So they don't just talk about personal selflessness, like me and you and all beings. They also talk about phenomena, all the other things, the inanimate things, and minds, and nirvana, enlightenment. So they talk about selflessness with regard to all phenomena. But of the two Hinayana schools, they only talk about selflessness of persons. Then the second point, they assert truly existent external phenomena. So I already explained that a little bit, but don't worry if you don't understand it, it'll get more clear later. So they both say things do exist out there and they're truly existent. They exist from their own side, they're really there. So another point, third one is they do not accept omniscience nor obstructions to omniscience, which Venerable calls cognitive obscurations. They do believe that the Buddha is all-knowing. They have the term all-knowing. But what that means is the Buddha is able to know everything, but only one thing at a time. Whatever the Buddha turns his mind to, he can know it. But he can't know everything all at once. And that's the meaning of omniscience. So in the Mahayana schools, we say the Buddha is omniscient. And what that means is Buddha knows everything all the time. Like every single moment, every single instance, with every one of his minds, every moment of his consciousness, he knows all phenomena, everything that exists. So the Hinayana tenet systems don't say that. And so since they don't accept omniscience, they also don't accept that there are obscurations to omniscience that have to be overcome. So that's one difference. And then another one, last one, is they do not use the term Buddha nature, nor accept that all beings can become Buddha. So they would say some beings can become Buddha, obviously. Shakyamuni Buddha became a Buddha, and they do assert there are bodhisattvas who aspire to become Buddhas and practice very hard and become Buddhas. But they don't say that's doable by everybody. All beings can become Buddhas. Whereas in the Mahayana, most Mahayana schools, there's some Chittamatrans who say there are some beings who will not become Buddhas. We'll get to that later, but most Mahayana schools say that everybody can become enlightened. In the definition of a Vaibhashika, it also says they do not assert self-cognizers. So you may have heard of that before. It's also called self-knowers. So some schools like Sautrantika and the Chittamatra say that whenever we see an object or perceive an object with any of our senses, we have a visual consciousness that sees the object, the blue thermos, and then there's another consciousness existing simultaneous with that, and that consciousness sees the eye consciousness that sees the thermos. And we need to have that other consciousness to be able to remember that we had that experience, to be able to say later, I saw the thermos. If we didn't have that other mind that's looking at the mind that sees the thermos, we wouldn't be able to remember that. That's the meaning of a self-cognizer. Now, some of the schools, like Prasangika and Vaibashika, and I forget who else. Anyway, some of the schools do not accept that. They refute it. They say no such thing, and we don't need it. It's enough just to see the thermos, and then later we remember seeing it. We don't have to have that other mind that sees that mind. Because they say, if that was necessary, if it was necessary to have a second mind seeing the first mind, to be able to remember that we had that first mind, then you would need another mind to look at that second mind, and then you need another one looking at that one, and it would on and on infinitely. Infinite regress, or whatever they call it. And so they say, no, there's no such thing as self-cognizance. So anyway, the Vaibhashikas do not accept self-cognizance. Okay, so we'll stop there and make a dedication of the merit, the positive energy. We started off with a good motivation, a positive altruistic motivation. So now we'll dedicate, share the merit with all living beings.
Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity. It's good to review this after 40 years. But it comes up again and again, you know. I mean, once you learn this stuff and then you study other topics, you know, it's there in Madhyamaka and